Hey everybody, Nick Espinoza, your chief security fanatic here. Don't forget to subscribe. And this week's deep dive is actually on DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, and our data privacy. I want to talk about everything we know so far. Now, I'm going to give you my standard political spiel here that simply is cybersecurity is agnostic to politics, but we're not immune from it. So I don't care if you're a big fan of DOGE, you hate DOGE, etc., etc. I want to focus essentially on data privacy, which I'm an expert at. And so by virtue of that, I'm not really going to be talking about anything else. And this is what we know of as of Monday, March 17, 2025, and it's coming from various sources that I will name as I am going through this. And like I said, this is not going to be about all of the firings, office shutterings, and all that kind of stuff that DOGE is doing. What we're solely talking about here is their access to data, what they have access to the best of our knowledge, and the privacy implications therein. And so we will break this down basically by U.S. government department, and I'm going to end with analysis, although I'm not saying I'm necessarily not going to be riffing here, but obviously I will make my opinion known as opposed to fact. So we're less than 2 months now into the new Trump administration. There's already been a ton of news happening here, and it starts on January 20th, obviously, when now President Trump, then President-elect Trump, was sworn into office, and essentially on that very same day, this kicks off because an executive order was issued on January 20th entitled Establishing and Implementing the President's Department of Government Efficiency. Quote, the United States Digital Service is hereby publicly renamed as the United States DOGE Service, USDS, and shall be established in the Executive Office of the President. Basically, as official departments require an act of Congress, this essentially circumvented that by simply cannibalizing an existing department and then changing its name. So, to be clear for the record, this is the legal right of the president from what I read and what I understand. I'm not a lawyer, don't play one on TV. So, at this point, DOGE has essentially been granted access to most unclassified data held by U.S. government agencies. And that same day, on January 20th, as DOGE was being formed, Vivek Ramaswamy, who was going to be the other head of DOGE with Elon Musk, departed and resigned. So, DOGE was also sued, for the record, minutes after President Trump's inauguration that Monday by public interest law firm National Security Counselors. That group said that DOGE's agenda breaks the 1972 Federal Advisory Committee Act, or FACA, that essentially requires advisory committees to follow specific rules on disclosure, hiring, and other practices. FACA also requires relatively balanced representations, publicly available meetings, and a public record of those meetings. The government runs on transparency, and we will be talking about that in my analysis section. Now, 2 other lawsuits were filed by, basically right on the heels of that, by progressive consumer rights advocacy group Public Citizen and the pro-democracy organization known as Democracy Forward. All 3 of these lawsuits allege that the creation of DOGE should not be considered a federal agency, which can only happen through an act of Congress, but rather an advisory committee. In other words, DOGE is simply an advisory committee, not an actual department, even though an actual department was renamed. Now, on January 21st, DOGE got an official government website. There was barely anything on it, but doge.gov essentially became real, where people could access it, but there really wasn't anything there, at least at that time. On top of this, the Campaign Legal Center, or CLC, filed FOIA, or Freedom of Information Request Acts, requests seeking information from the U.S. DOGE Service and 28 additional agencies. Quote, the request will shed light on the actions of the U.S. DOGE Service Temporary Organization and its role within the executive branch, the creation of DOGE teams, and the actions and role of the DOGE transition team. This information is urgently needed to inform the public about the role and actions of DOGE within the federal government, end quote. And again, government runs on transparency, which we will talk about. And there were a ton more lawsuits, but obviously we know that DOGE has stuck around. So let's dive into their access. And again, we're not talking about the mass firings or the, tell me 5 things you did at work email type stuff, canceling of contracts, all that kind of stuff. We're only talking about data access and potential data privacy issues. And so once again, let's talk about essentially this department and what I could find. Now, all of these news sources have various dates in the past 2 months, slightly less than 2 months. So I'm just using the publication name and not the date because they're all over the map. I don't want to confuse chronology here with actually what is happening. And finally, remember, I'm only focusing on data privacy violations and or breaches and nothing else. I can't stress that enough. We're calling balls and strikes here. So the first one up is the Social Security Administration. They're home to much of our personally identifiable information as we use our social security numbers as de facto national IDs, even though they're technically not that. Now, PBS reported that basically the Social Security Administration's acting commissioner stepped down from her role at the agency over DOGE's request to access Social Security recipient information. And the Associated Press reported that a group of labor unions were asking a federal court for an emergency order to stop DOGE from accessing the sensitive Social Security data of basically all of us. And if you're an American, you've got a Social Security number. Now, included in the filing is also an affidavit from Tiffany Flick. She is a former senior official at the agency who says that career civil servants are trying to protect data from DOGE. Quote, a disregard for our careful privacy systems and processes now threaten the security of data SSA houses about millions of Americans. The Social Administration, for the record, Social Security Administration, obviously very sensitive information. Now, Wired reported that at least 10 people associated with DOGE are now working at the Social Security Administration. This includes a number of young engineers, meaning computer engineers, whose presence at Social Security has not been reported, obviously in violation of transparency, which we will talk about. The next department is Treasury, and according to Fortune, a 25-year-old DOGE staffer violated Treasury policy by emailing a spreadsheet containing unencrypted personal data to 2 Trump administration officials. The email was sent by Marco Alez, who later resigned after being linked to a social media account that shared racist posts. I believe he was also rehired into another department a couple weeks later. Now, in a court filing, a federal official revealed that Mr. Alez sent the sensitive information unencrypted and without prior approval, which violated the Bureau of Fiscal Services policies on handling sensitive data. This spreadsheet was sent to 2 United States General Service Administration officials and contained some personally identifiable information, or PII. Now, Wired also had on Treasury, and this is deeply concerning to me, that the U.S. Treasury Department and White House officials have repeatedly denied that technologists associated with DOGE have the ability to basically rewrite code of the payment system through which the vast majority of federal spending flows. Wired's reporting shows, though, that basically at the time these statements were made, DOGE did have right access, meaning they could manipulate the code. On top of that, sources told Wired that at least one note was added to Treasury records indicating that he no longer had right access before senior IT staff stated that it was actually rescinded. So in other words, if you are able to write code, you have the ability to potentially copy out data, move data in different ways, or basically enter a back door that could potentially give you remote access in some way, shape, or form. The point is, without transparency, we don't necessarily know what happened. Now, the next department on the list is the IRS, or Internal Revenue Service, and I'm sure nobody is, pulling out the large violin for these guys, but nevertheless, this is a concern of well. Now, this is coming from FedScoop, in a lawsuit filed on Monday, February 17th in the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia. The Center for Taxpayer Rights, Main Street Alliance, and the National Federation of Federal Employees, as well as the Communication Workers of America, alleged that DOGE's access to the IRS systems has harmed their constituents' privacy interests and exposed their private information to heightened risks. These plaintiffs claim that IRS defendants, basically the tax agency itself, Acting Commissioner Douglas O'Donnell, the Treasury Department, and Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent unlawfully permitted DOGE representatives to have quote-unquote broad access to tax return information, quote, in an arbitrary and capricious manner that does not comport with historical or existing IRS practice or policies, or consider the consequences of such access, end quote. The IRS defendants did not comply with the statutory required security protections for the data-rich systems that they are charged with overseeing. This is according to the allegations in the lawsuit. In addition to basically disclosing personal data contained in tax records without actually having obtained consent following the Privacy Act requirements. Now, DOGE defendants, meanwhile, are also accused of breaching secure government systems and unlawfully disclosing the personal data of tens of millions of individuals. The plaintiffs are asking the court to cut off DOGE's access to the IRS systems and order them to delete any information they acquired from those systems or devices after January 19, as well as remove any software the team has installed on IRS systems while barring it from adding any additional tools moving forward. So obviously a lot going on in the IRS, and that is obviously of deep concern as well. But on top of it, we have HUD, or the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And according to ProPublica, DOGE gained access to HUD, specifically their systems containing confidential personal information about hundreds of thousands of alleged victims of housing discrimination, including victims of domestic violence. Access to that system, called the HUD Enforcement Management System, or HEMS, is basically strictly limited usually because it contains medical records, financial files, documents that may list social security numbers, and other private information. DOGE sought access, and HUD granted it last week, according to the information reviewed by ProPublica and two officials familiar with the matter. Now, next department is the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services under Health and Human Services. And according to ABC News, the CMS has also been collaborating with DOGE since February 5th, according to a CMS official. And HIPAA Journal reported that privacy advocates have expressed concern about the privacy risks from providing DOGE with access to CMS systems, as the agency provides health coverage to more than 160 million Americans through various programs such as Medicaid, Medicare, and the Children's Health Insurance Program. Now, next up is a combination of the Department of Education and the Office of Personnel Management. And according to FedScoop, a federal judge on Monday, February 24th, blocked basically DOGE's access to personally identifiable information at the Department of Education and also Office of Personnel Management, or OPM. Additionally, the order stops OPM from disclosing PII to, quote, any OPM employees working principally on the DOGE agenda who has been granted access to OPM records for the principal purpose of implementing the DOGE agenda. That is basically according to the judge. And the exception to that is the Chief Information Officer of OPM, Greg Hogan. Now, on top of it, we also have Homeland Security. Because, according to CNN, Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem on Sunday, February 9th, acknowledged that essentially DOGE, which had basically been tasked with slashing federal spending, also had access to her agency's data, including that of federal disaster aid recipients' personal information as part of that audit. And basically, the new head of this, former South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem, welcomed that. So she appeared on CNN's State of the Union and said that President Trump had, quote unquote, authorized DOGE basically to gain access to the DHS network, adding that she, quote unquote, absolutely was comfortable with that. So there you go on that one. On top of it, we have USAID. That made obviously the news for cutting off a whole bunch of different things. But let's talk about the specifics of data privacy, which is pretty quick because DOGE was granted access to quote unquote God mode status with quote full unrestricted access to the agency's digital infrastructure, end quote. That is according to PBS. That database essentially would contain all of the personal information of all USAID workers around the entire globe, not to mention potentially personally private information that had been collected by those workers on foreigners living in foreign countries. So we'll see what happens there. And those are the privacy-focused issues right now, as I mentioned, March 17, 2025, and I'm not including alleged physical breaches or things like possible code manipulation of the air traffic control system at FAA, access to the United Postal Service system, access to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, access to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, access to the Department of Defense, access to the National Institutes of Health, and more. So with that, let's dive into analysis here. And as I've mentioned, basically, the president has the right to administer departments in the executive branch how he sees fit. However, there are guidelines in place that help protect our data and also provide oversight on the who, what, when, where, why of data access in order to ensure proper transparency, which is something that is clearly lacking here at the moment, hence the multiple court challenges, etc., etc. That's just objectively true, that transparency is not the name of the game in the same way we've traditionally had that. And so some of those checks against this that help protect us as U.S. citizens is the Privacy Act of 1974. The main premise of this act is to let American citizens know what systems there are and the types of data that the government collects about us. It also mandates that federal agencies must establish records for lawful purposes only and to safeguard them as well. Now, another law, interestingly enough, is the Tax Reform Act of 1976, which has something called Section 6103, and that places limits on the IRS and its ability to disclose your tax return information, but there are some exceptions to that. So, for example, the IRS may share data with law enforcement for investigative and prosecution of non-tax criminal laws, and also basically Social Security for matters regarding Social Security and Medicare tax liabilities. Now, beyond this, we have other ways of oversight here. So for the first part is congressional oversight. Every department essentially has civilian oversight through Congress. They are there essentially to check the power of the presidency, to ensure transparency, and on and on. On top of it, we have the Freedom of Information Act. If the government is working properly, we can basically submit FOIA requests to see what exactly is going on. But if it is not using a standard record-keeping system like the National Archives and Record Administration administers, or NARA, then we have a problem. And we've been hearing reports, but I've not been able to confirm it, which is why I didn't go too in depth with it, that DOGE is not aligning with NARA's standards. And again, it's probably because we're not seeing the data that they're collecting beyond, let's say, a rogue email that's accidentally sent or possibly intentionally sent with an absolute ton of PII in it. On top of this, there are also limitations and considerations here that we should have just overarchingly in the government. So removal of a department requires a congressional vote. You can't just simply wave your hands as president or sign an executive order and say, I am killing a department there. That requires typically a vote in Congress. Now, on top of that, funding or defunding of the department. So, let's say the president can't unilaterally do this. Well, the president can defund a department. Basically, that's the job of the Congress. Congress runs the budget for the entire government. Now, they may work with or collaborate with the president, but historically speaking, the president has to go to Congress to say, I want this funded or this defunded, and he can wheel and deal, beg, whatever it is to get that. But that's not necessarily happening here. And on top of that, there is also limitations and considerations on the president's ability to declassify whatever he wants. So, for example, there are procedural guidelines. Typically, there's a formal review process to ensure that sensitive information is handled properly. However, the president can technically bypass or alter these procedures, although that is a very unusual thing to do. Again, these are administered by NARA, and so we have paperwork to ensure that essentially the government is being transparent and basically things are properly being classified and declassified. On top of it, nuclear secrets cannot be declassified unilaterally by a president. It requires, thanks to the Atomic Energy Act, that the heads of DOD, Energy, and the president, 2 out of 3, have to agree. And here we are. On top of it, there is legal accountability. So even though the president has broad authority, abuse of that power, so for example, let's say declassifying information for political gain, could lead basically to significant political or legal repercussions. And for the record, I did an in-depth segment on that a couple of years ago in the wake of the Mar-a-Lago document scandal and all of that. So go check that out. On top of this, although the authority is broad, presidents typically rely on standard processes involving national security advisors and the intelligence community to manage classification and declassification responsibly. So in that sense, when we are looking at personally identifiable information, that is not considered classified, but that would be controlled unclassified information, which means there is a framework of laws, governance, and transparency of access into essentially that. Now, my biggest concern here is that transparency. That's the name of the game here. And think about why, basically, in a scenario like DOGE, that is so unbelievably important, or any other inspector. Not that I'm equating what DOGE is doing with a typical inspector general, but it's basically should be the same thing. Transparency ensures accountability. We as citizens can hold our leaders and institutions accountable when actions and decisions are transparent. It helps to prevent corruption, abuse of power, and misconduct. On top of that, it helps to ensure trust and credibility. Transparency fosters public trust, which then strengthens the relationship between us, the citizen, and our government. A transparent government is perceived as more legitimate and credible. On top of that, we also have prevention of corruption. Openness reduces opportunities for corruption by exposing the decision-making process and financial activities to scrutiny. And we also have protection of rights and liberties. Transparency ensures that the government respects our civil liberties, our human rights, and also the rule of law. It makes it difficult to conceal violations and misuse of power when everything is in the sunlight. And finally, it also helps to ensure economic stability. Transparent governments attract investment by creating predictable and reliable regulatory environments and reducing risk perceptions. And while that's less important here, when we were talking about data privacy, I think it's an important one to understand just how important transparency is to a government. And so by virtue of that, that is everything that DOGE is doing right now. And again, this isn't political. I don't care or if you love or hate DOGE or what they're doing, or you want a flamethrower taken to everything, or you want to preserve old institutions, whatever it is. The point is, when it comes to our data and our right to privacy and the required transparency that a government has, that should be sacrosanct. And I don't care who you are or what you believe, because if we don't have that, it goes both ways politically, and that ain't good. So I'll leave it at that. That is your deep dive of the week. But quite frankly, we should all be a little concerned about this, and we should all be really paying attention. And please like, share, follow me here on Facebook and Twitter at NickAESP. And please feel free to subscribe to me at YouTube as well, also Blue Sky and Mastodon. And as always, stay safe, stay online, and please attempt to stay private and informed. And hopefully the government will stay transparent. Take care.